Hello, I'm Kian Hosseini,
I'm Daniel Lewicki.
and we're your hosts for Post and Lentil, title pending.
Yes. The title is going to be whatever we upload. If it's Post and Lentil, perfect. If it's not, then, egg on our face, I suppose.
Would you like to introduce our concept and our podcast to our audience?
Kian and I met in architecture school.
Yes.
And have worked on several projects outside of architecture school with Studio Mao, formerly Sham.
Sham Collective.
That's right, Sham Design Collective. We're partners at Sham Design
Yes.
Collective, senior partners, actually. We met up in Kensington about a month ago. Mm-hmm. We went to the Kensington Brewery and ordered a flight from them to sample all of their beers. And as we did so, we began free associating beer with architecture concepts. I think you said this would make a great podcast. I was like, oh, yeah, let's do it.
Definitely. I mean, I don't remember who said it, but I think the idea just somehow came up.
Yeah.
And I think we were both suddenly super excited for it that we started recording on spot.
And it was, oh my God, cell phone recordings in a bar, like with music playing, people talking. It was like the discussion was surprisingly
It was
good.
good. Yeah, it was very spontaneous and also very informative for both of us, I think.
And so we've decided to recreate that in a controlled environment. And,
AKA Daniel's house.
Yes, aka my parents' home, with a howling and barking puppy outside. Don't worry, she's fine. She's just very excited that Kian is here.
Okay, well, we have 5 different kinds of beer here, and we're going to drink them and think about architecture concepts, histories, and time periods, different ideas.
Whatever
different-
crosses our mind.
It's more of a free association at this point, and we want to be a little spontaneous about it. I think it will help the conversation to go in a slightly more interesting direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The beer in this case, or the food in other cases, is going to be our idiot. We're going to be reading the beers as
Exactly.
text.
So I'm going to start with the first beer. I'm going to describe its appearance. It looks like a very light beer.
Okay.
It's a little foamy, not too much. It's very transparent compared to a few other beers that we have here. And we poured a lot more of this than any other beer. So
We were very enthusiastic.
yes. Okay, so I'm going to drink it, and I guess we can talk about what comes to mind.
Excellent. I'm just watching Kian drink beer right now. It's great.
Okay. Okay, this feels... It's a little citrusy, and it's very light, of course. It's not that bitter at all. It has a more citrus bitterness to it
Really?
than like a regular beer bitterness. It's like a grapefruit. Do you know how sometimes it's a little bitter?
Yeah, it's like a bite.
Yeah, it's like that.
Drink along with us, listeners. Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
Right?
Yeah, these are also, just for context, these are also have been sitting out for a little while, so they're a little
quite warm.
Yeah, but that does sort of expand the taste palette. So I'm going to say we did that on purpose.
I think it's a very... I want to say simple, but not in terms of like it's a tasteless beer. Mm-hmm. But it's a nice beer that you can drink. It doesn't have like a specific, memorable, perhaps, experience to it. Quite ornamentless.
I wouldn't even have said simple. I would have said something like it's well balanced.
Right.
Yeah. Like it's not boring.
Yeah, it's not boring.
But it's not plain.
Yes.
It's what's the phrase I'm looking for?
It's a modernist beer.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, the reason I said it's kind of ornamentless is because I was just thinking about modernism and the lack of ornament and like pure expressions, quotation marks around it.
Well, yeah.
I guess we can talk about some modernism. And
absolutely.
Ornament and crime would be a good paper to talk about.
Because this beer is criminally good.
Well, yeah, Ornament and Crime by Adolf Loos. I suppose in the early 20s.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So, for those who might not perhaps be familiar with this paper in particular, it is a paper written by Adolf Loos in 1913, and it is perhaps some sort of a manifesto to the modernist movement that would emerge. The main thesis of the paper is that ornament is something that should be left behind in the modern age because it's quite unnecessary, unproductive, and does not show the spirit of the modern age. His main argument is that we should leave ornament for the sake of pure expressions and functionalist architecture. He goes on to unfortunately associate ornamentation with tattoos
Yeah.
and colonial understandings of barbarism and those concepts, and then he identifies, criminals have tattoos, therefore we shouldn't have tattoos on our buildings.
The dangers of free association.
Yeah, which is quite problematic. But I guess what can we do about it now?
Well, 1912 Germany, right, or Austria?
Austria.
The simplification in terms of ornament that Loos was talking about was very industrial.
Exactly.
And it was coming from a very artisan place. When I think of ornament, I think of like tchotchkes and like all the random nonsense on the piano behind me. When he was talking about it, he would have been thinking of like ornate window dressings, moldings.
Yeah, it's more about leaving that artisan culture behind and moving into the industrial age where everything is mass produced and
stripping everything
down. To more efficiently produce things, right? So,
well, not necessarily more efficiently produce things, because keep in mind his interiors were remarkably colorful and remarkably ornate.
Course. Like, I think what is important to think about here is the role of ideology. So you could have an ideological understanding of why things should be ornamentless, which comes from that mass production, but then you can step away from it and be a little bit hypocritical in a sense, where you produce functionality in just a visual way. It's more of a expression now. It becomes like a style more than it is a real functional way to produce things. Just like Le Corbusier and like all those modernist architects, where functional for them slowly becomes a style and becomes an aesthetic way of doing architecture. Although I think it's also interesting to think about the color of white. Color itself is a form of ornament. So the white color that goes on the walls of a modernist building is in itself a way of expression, is itself an ornament. So while we're stepping away from certain known ornaments, such as Gothic, Renaissance, those familiar kinds of expressions, architectural expressions, what was happening was that new forms of ornament through materiality, through color, were coming into surface. So that's what I mean when I talk about ideology, which is, it's like you think you're doing something, but what you're actually doing is not exactly what you think you're doing. You might have been thinking about functionality in the sense that, you're producing something for the modern age, which is stripped of ornaments, but all that was happening was that new forms of ornaments were emerging in that period.
Okay. So it sort of sounds like a paradigm in the sense that when you're within that ideology, you need to be external to it to recognize the hang-ups and tenets of it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the things that were introduced by modernism, we still haven't stepped out of. For instance, functionality in architecture is a lens through which people critique architecture. For instance, efficiency of circulation is something that people often nowadays think about when they want to critique a building.
They certainly do.
The thing to remember is that efficiency is not a sign of good design.
No.
I mean, it's a way to design something to make it efficient for certain purposes, but it's not a measure by which to understand what a good design is.
Absolutely.
So when we are assessing buildings today, we should think about efficiency, but that should not be our sole lens through which we think about things.
I agree completely. Inefficiency can be a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I'm specifically thinking about the multiple different corridors at the Daniels faculty at U of T, where there's, that old ornate corridor, which doesn't necessarily, I mean, it does serve a purpose, but I could easily see them demolishing that and just building something much more efficient, much more useful. But that inefficiency really helps characterize the movement through the building.
Right.
There's a hallway. The Daniels building is built like a...
It's a C. No, well, it's more of a round structure now. It's a
I would
loop.
have said it's like a courtyard building,
Right.
with a lecture hall as the courtyard.
Correct.
And there's a peripheral hallway that, in a just world would run, sort of allow circulation to move through it freely all the way around the courtyard. But it doesn't, because the library requires certain controls on circulation so that people don't run away with books.
Right.
And that means that instead of an O forming a circulatory O around the courtyard, you have, like a C. And I feel like that is actually a huge benefit to Daniels, because that sort of corridor ends up being unused between the main circulatory pathway sort of moving vertically
Right.
and the library is a really interesting space because it's so useless in your day-to-day use of the building.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not 100% useless.
Oh,
but
no, not at all.
No. Like, I mean, it's being used as exhibition space, as
Exactly.
a place to present models, present your projects. Those things take place in that area. But what I want to actually talk about is
No, it's fine.
so there's this theory which is called the doorway effect. And what it is that it talks about our minds resetting when we walk from one room to the next through a doorway.
Right.
And imagine like an open floor office space, right? So what happens is that you don't get that resetting that happens by architecture in a space like that. So an office space becomes a cluttered mental space.
Yeah.
A space where your mind clutters 8 hours a day until you step out of that office space through a doorway. So thinking about functionality in that sense, like an open floor office space with cubicles is functional, but is it beneficial to workers? That's something to think about when it comes to modernism.
Totally.
Right? So like let's think about like a more traditional house or a more traditional building with a lot of rooms, hallways, different types of office spaces. I think those are more humane ways to produce a work environment.
I agree,
because even in this theoretical way, which I actually don't know if it's a real thing. I mean, it happens when
Scientific American seems to think it's a real thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense. Like when you walk from your room to the fridge, you forget what you wanted.
Yeah.
Right? Your
No,
mind
exactly.
literally resets.
I mean, I just forget that because I'm pissed drunk. But, but generally, no, I mean, I completely agree. You can see that so clearly in how, especially at the architecture faculty, grad students will occasionally build themselves rooms around their workspaces. They don't, as far as I know, do that to be antisocial, although I'm sure that helps. Having your own space and being able to move between spaces, that kind of chronological understanding of architecture is very important, and it allows you to clear your RAM, as it were.
Exactly. I think the takeaway is that maybe efficiency is not the best lens to critique architecture.
No, not at all. A completely mechanical understanding
Yeah.
of human beings is
Yeah.
always going to fail.
So we're going to taste the second beer now. Daniel, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, let's do it. Rock and roll. Okay, so it smells, I'm getting hints of citrus.
Huh.
The index of refraction is extremely high. It is almost entirely opaque.
Well, I mean, it looks very lemony.
It does.
It just looks like someone squeezed lemon into this
Yeah,
cup.
it does. I'm almost expecting seeds to float up to the surface, especially after tasting it, because it is very lemony.
it is very
This is
lemony.
a very lemony beer.
So we were able to guess exactly what the taste is going to be by just looking at this beer.
Yeah, I'm curious if this is a sour, because this tastes like it's right on that edge between a
Yeah.
sour and a regular beer.
Definitely is sour for me, which I like.
Me too.
I'm actually intrigued by the fact that we were able to guess the taste by just looking at this. This somehow reminds me of The Duck and the Decorated Shed
Oh,
by Venturi and Scott Brown.
yeah.
If you recall, and we were going to recap this for our listeners, the duck is a building that takes the form of its function.
Yes.
So let's say a building looks like a duck. What is its function? It sells ducks.
Yeah, it sells chicken, I believe, to like food as food.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Or a church is another good example.
Right. Yeah. So it signifies its function through its appearance in a very literal way. And I think this was what it did. This beer literally signified its taste by its sole appearance.
Absolutely.
So I think maybe we can talk about postmodernism since we're already in that.
Here we go.
In that
Into
area.
the trenches. On the Kian Hosseini bingo card, we've now hit ideology and we're hitting postmodernism.
Yeah, this is going to be an exciting talk. So, postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Well, I mean, some people argue...
Comes after modernism.
It definitely comes after modernism. Its name comes from the philosophical tradition that was happening at the time. And it does have some similarities and parallels with the school of thought that was postmodernism in philosophy and literature and all those academic and humanities thinking.
Okay. In a lot of ways, postmodernism now is used as a slur against certain schools of intellectual thought. So, like in a philosophical context,
Right.
how would you describe postmodernism?
Well, postmodernism is basically, well, we can't say basically, but what it was trying to do was to rethink structures, structures that were carried on in, like, through millennia by philosophical traditions and were more or less thought of as units that could not be dismantled.
They were considered real.
They were considered real, right? And what happens in postmodernism is that a lot of these are questioned. For instance, Foucault questions power structures, how power structures function in society, how they shape the way we behave on day to day.
Okay.
Wittgenstein deconstructs language, thinks about logic, all those things. It's a way to rethink critically about these traditions that were carried on through generations.
So then, postmodernism in architecture isn't just a reaction to modernism.
No.
Cool. All right. We're done here.
Well,
I've been Daniel Lewicki, and this has been Kian Hosseini.
no, okay, so postmodernism is in a sense a reaction to modernism.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, but itself falls into the same sort of traps that modernism fell into.
So this is going to get lost in editing, but you were talking about postmodernism in architecture as more of a stylistic approach than postmodernism in other intellectual disciplines. But style is so integral to architecture, and it dictates so much of how architecture functions. Like, I'm not sure how you can divorce architecture from style when you say that postmodernism is much more stylistic.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with that. What I meant when I said postmodernism being more of a stylistic approach. Of course, stylistic approaches are one of the main things to think about.
Yeah.
But what I meant was the difference between postmodernism and other academic disciplines is that there was more of a critique involved in those other disciplines, whereas architecture was more of a nostalgic lens.
Really?
Right? So what happened was that people started to look at history and be more historically aware of architecture, but not in a very direct sense. So what happened was that many styles, symbols, elements of architecture that make up the visual language of architecture.
Like the common signifiers
Yes,
of architecture.
exactly. Came from history, like from Renaissance, from Baroque.
Pillars.
But, exactly, pillars, pediments, all those things were brought back, of course, rethought, but at the same time, they lost their original meaning.
They lost their integral qualities.
Exactly. So postmodernism basically brought these elements as pure elements and nothing else.
But that does act as a critique of modernism. Like, functionally, bringing this ornament and bringing these objects, stripping them of their meaning, and then placing them in architecture. It's very much only in a retrospective way.
Right.
Like, you can't design realistically with that kind of critique in mind, I think, unless you're Peter Eisenman. Does that work?
I mean, yeah.
I think that works. Venturi's probably a better
Right.
example. But it is a critique.
Well, no, it absolutely is a critique.
Right.
What I want to suggest, though, is that it still falls into certain traps that modernism fell into,
Okay.
which are ideological traps.
I'm going to start tallying the number of times you mention ideology.
Ideology is beautiful. The myth of modernism was functionality, right?
And cleanliness and
yes,
the 5 pillars of modernism.
Exactly. So we had a myth, Postmodernism's approach was to deconstruct that myth and reveal that it is a myth. But what happened along with this was a creation of a new myth.
Right.
This new myth, which was displayed in the recent exhibition in the Canadian Centre for Architecture.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, it was called Architecture Itself and Other Postmodern Myths.
Okay.
Curated by Sylvia Levin.
Oh, cool.
In this exhibition, what is showcased is a revealing of what the myth of postmodernism was. The main myth was that there is this thing called architecture itself. And it comes about through a certain process, which is an architect sitting down, having a sketchbook in front of them, and starting out with sketching a design that is very rough,
Okay.
kind of like a Norman Foster-esque.
Yeah, I'm
kind
picturing
of like,
Frank Gehry crumpling up a tissue.
Like making this rough model, and suddenly that becomes the building.
Yeah.
But this was actually debunked. This was not how postmodern architects were approaching architecture at all. One of the things that was revealed by going through documents, not drawings, documents of architects, like checks and like receipts, all those very documents that were just stored somewhere in the archives of the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And by opening these up, things that were revealed showed that this myth of architecture itself was false. Of course it was false.
I mean,
but
yeah.
the fact that it was the postmodern myth shows that postmodernism fell into kind of that mystical, mythical kind of approach to architecture that modernism fell into. Right? So
through its deconstruction.
Through its deconstruction, exactly. So it started out deconstructing modernism as a myth, but itself fell into another myth.
We referenced Venturi and Scott Brown, and critics of postmodernism and modernism seem to have this incredibly strong desire to create mythic figures in architecture. Venturi, Scott Brown, Eisenman, Corbu, Mies, obviously. It rings true when you talk about creating a new mythos despite wanting to break down the previous paradigm.
Right. So what was revealed actually, which is deconstructing that myth of postmodernism through the lens of postmodernism, which I will talk about in a second. So what was revealed through these discoveries of documents in archives was that actually architects didn't start from sketching stuff. They started from making a list of the books they want to take out from the library. They listed numbers of things that they want, like specific measurements, specific costs. All those things were initial stepping stones of what design would be.
Yeah, it turns out a multi-million-dollar building doesn't just begin when, again, Frank Gehry crumples up a piece of paper.
Exactly, right? It's actually funny when we think about it now, but it is how we think about architects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? As people who take out a paper and start sketching a building. And this is how architects are advertised even to this day.
This is how architects are taught.
Yeah. We talked about the example of Norman Foster and his napkin sketches.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's clear now through this postmodern lens, which I believe it's more of a critical lens that postmodernism ever was.
Because it's trying to exist outside of the ideology of postmodernism.
Exactly. Well, I mean, eventually, perhaps, once we are able to historicize postmodernism in a few decades, we might find that we fell into some sort of mystical traps.
We're guaranteed to.
Yeah, absolutely. But the important thing is that by historicizing postmodernism, we were able to crack it open and understand exactly what was going on in this kind of heroic period of architecture.
The Silver Age.
Yeah. Postmodernism is in many ways, to this day, very influential. Right?
Absolutely.
Some people argue that we are still in postmodernism and we never left postmodernism.
We are definitely the prisoners of postmodernism.
Yeah. It's good to be able to historicize it now. We are about half a century away from when it started.
Really?
Yeah. Imagine like
Pruitt-Igoe was that long ago?
Yeah, 60s.
God damn.
Yeah, it's been a while. Do you remember those days, Daniel?
Nah, man, the 60s are a blur.
What I want to emphasize again is that through historicization that we can bring out these misunderstandings.
How would you historicize this beer?
This beer? The lemony period.
So what you're saying is that we drank a duck.
We did drink a duck. Wow, we've come a long way from when we talked about the duck.
Yeah, listeners, it's been an hour.
Yeah, for us, it's been an hour. For you, probably 10 minutes.
Yeah, hopefully, if I do my job in editing, hopefully it'll be 10 minutes.
Yeah, so we were drinking a duck.
Yep.
So we're going to...
Not drinking a decorated shed.
I'm happy that you felt the need to mention that.
If we were drinking it out of the bottle, would we be drinking a decorated shed?
I think so, because that way we would have been drinking while reading what it is, which is a decorated shed. It's more of a language approach as opposed to a visual vocabulary.
So that's the thing. If you're drinking it out of a glass bottle, you're drinking a duck. If you're drinking it out of a can, you're drinking a decorated shed.
Absolutely.
Full circle, baby.
Daniel's very excited. I'm excited.
There's a lot of hand gestures happening here on both of our ends.
I think one day we should release a video of one of our recording sessions because I think it's very exciting.
It is. It is. Absolutely. I'm actually doing a handstand while I speak to you right now. Kian hasn't felt the need to mention it because this is completely normal, and he is actually standing on exactly one finger.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's only one finger suspending Kian off the floor.
If you hear any cracks in my voice...
Well, this has officially gone off the rails.
I'm going to stop now and perhaps move to the third beer.
Yes.
Since you started with the second beer, I'm going to taste this one.
A fair and equitable solution.
This is communism.
Fair and balanced.
I'm going to taste this third beer. It's definitely not a dark beer.
Okay, no surprises so far.
It's quite light, actually.
Really?
It looks light. I'm going to try it.
What do you make of it? You really need to sip into the microphone for the ASMR crowd.
I think you should try this too because I feel like it tastes like watermelon.
Does it really?
Yeah.
Holy crap. Wait a minute.
I mean, there's a little hint of watermelon.
Oh my God.
Right?
Oh my God. Yeah, now that you mention it, it's not even text, it's subtext.
Yeah, it's the aftertaste that kind of reminds you a little bit of summertime.
Yeah.
And that watermelon taste.
I'm drinking a beer, but it's turning into a watermelon in my mouth.
Yeah. It's like, you know those watermelon gums that taste disgusting?
Hubba Bubbas. Yeah. I do know those.
This is that beer. Watermelon-y architecture.
I wouldn't necessarily directly relate it to watermelon, but I would relate it to turning into watermelon after you drink it. Mm-hmm. Like it's the aftertaste.
Right. So some sort of conversion of experience.
Yeah. It's a subversion of expectations. Mm-hmm. What's a type of building that is one way in its exterior and is completely transformed in its interior?
Mm-hmm. Those who are familiar with the U of D St. George campus might be familiar with a building called the Robarts Library.
The best building in Toronto, I think you mean.
Yeah. So this building is a brutalist structure.
Yes.
Resembles a peacock, or some people argue it's a turkey.
I would argue very much towards the turkey.
Turkey? Well, it's a turkey peacock.
Yeah, with the Fisher Rare Books Library in the head of the turkey
Right.
and the stacks making up the feathers in the back.
Right. So we have this skin of a building which in no way resembles a library. Right. So you walk in this building and you're suddenly in a completely different space. You're in a space of study. You're in a library, you're in a quiet space, although it's a geometric space inside as well, much like the way that the outside form is structured. But the resemblance to a bird doesn't necessarily dictate a library, you know?
No, it's very much a duck, but it doesn't signify what you expect. It's like somebody took a cathedral and represented it with low polygons, you know?
Yeah, so it's a false duck.
It's a false duck.
It's a duck that
Holy
doesn't...
crap.
It doesn't...
No, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So it's a duck that is signifying some sort of function.
It's a duck wearing the skin of another duck.
Yeah.
Robarts murdered a cathedral, stripped it of its skin, and is now walking around in public.
I think that would be an interesting segue to...
No, I agree. It's an interesting segue to brutalism.
Yeah.
How would you define brutalism? Simple concrete forms, mega structures?
I wouldn't say simple. I would actually say very expressionist, because a lot of the building, like, there's no reason for Robarts to be shaped like a bird, right? Like, a lot of brutalist buildings have very deliberate and specific forms embedded in them that are specifically designed through this brutalist stage in architecture.
Absolutely.
Right? These like deep windows with a lot of actually ornamentation came back at this time.
100%. Right? The ornamentation is explicitly walking around wearing the skin of modernism.
Yeah, exactly. So the concrete comes back from modernism.
It never left.
It never left, but like it signifies modernism in a way.
Yeah.
But then you also have the re-emergence of ornaments,
like
in a very different
classical
way.
Forms.
But it's also very different from classical forms, right? The ornaments still take geometric and simple shapes.
Yes.
Right? But these simple shapes assemble together to produce this giant structure that is fully ornamented.
Yeah.
Right?
Like when I think of Place Bonaventure in Montreal or other brutalist buildings, they all reference architecture, but it's not like calling back to a specific era necessarily.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. I think it's just a reinvention of ornaments.
Yeah, it's a co-option of signifiers.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, this was a shorter talk than we had for other beers, but I think brutalism was a shorter
condensed
period than other periods.
And kind of overrepresented in Toronto, which is great. I'm super down.
Especially on the U of T campus.
Yeah.
We have a lot of really nice brutalist buildings, actually.
I'm not kidding when I say Robarts is my favorite building in Toronto because, like, it feels like a prank when you look at it.
Yeah.
Somebody pointed at that building and said, I need like several $1 million to build this. And somebody else said, sure, why not?
Yeah, I mean, there are some problems with brutalism. One of the main things that especially comes up in Robarts is the lack of natural lighting.
Yeah.
Right? Due to these really thin, thick windows, what you get is not a lot of natural lighting. So inside Robarts, there's a lot of artificial lighting to compensate.
Yeah.
Okay, so Daniel is now going to drink the fourth beer and try to find out what we can relate this to.
So this is the kind of beer that you can definitely tell from taste.
Really?
Yeah. This is a pale ale, for sure.
Oh, yeah?
I would have said this is an IPA.
Let me taste it.
IPAs are interesting because there's a whole cult surrounding them. There's people who are just madly in love with this type of beer. For the life of me, I can't figure out why. I mean, I think it has to do with however brewing sort of exploded in the United States. For some reason, Indiana Pale Ales are the shit there. And I can't figure out why they're so popular. But I can figure out what I'm going to associate this beer with. Frank Lloyd Wright.
Of course.
Like, Frank Lloyd Wright is one of those architects where, like, I don't understand why there's a cult of Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh my God, that's so hard to say. Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right.
You know? Damn it. So,
I did not mean that.
That's staying in. My heart breaks. But no, he is really popular. And I feel like it's like IPAs. This is the American beer. He is the American architect.
Right.
And that's why he is so incredibly popular.
He's absolutely influential in the way that he shaped a modernism fit for the United States.
Yeah.
Right? Modernism originating from Europe had to go through some sort of transformation to be suitable for the United States, right? Even though a lot of modernist architects immigrated to the United States, they brought with them the specific language that they built up in Europe.
Yeah, and there was a resistance in the United States to European architecture anyway.
Exactly. Like the Seagram building, while amazing, it's not an American, modernist building.
No, not at all.
It's a building designed by Mies.
Absolutely.
That's all that it is. So, I mean, for Frank Lloyd Wright to be able to translate those elements from modernism into an American language, I think was quite a task, right?
Absolutely. Would you have said that he transformed the language of modernism into an American context, or would you have said that he evolved in parallel to European modernism? Because everything I know about Frank Lloyd Wright suggests to me that he was influenced by European architecture, but he resented European architecture.
Yeah, so he was influenced in a geometric way, right?
Yeah.
Like his buildings have a lot of geometric qualities, but he never gave up things like ornament.
Yeah.
A lot of his buildings are quite ornament heavy with stained glass windows and like all those elements that come up in Gothic architecture, for example, right? He never gave those up. He was inspired by the modernist language in Europe.
Yes.
But he definitely invented something new.
Well, he was also not a mechanist. He was very much an artisan.
Right. He was a traditionalist. He would design literally everything in his houses, right?
And demand that it stayed original as much as possible.
Right.
Yes.
There are two funny stories relating to this idea that he was very particular about everything that he designed.
Yep.
The first story, Wright finished this building, let's say. It was a newly constructed building, and the client had just moved in. In their first days of stay, the client calls Wright and tells him, hey, the ceiling is leaking, and my desk is literally underneath the hall.
Yeah.
Can you do something about this? It's a new building. Why is it like this? And Wright's answer is that, well, you can just move the desk.
Problem solved.
Yeah, so like the way that he would think about this in architecture, even though there were flaws in the architecture in the end, they were not perhaps part of the conceptual design, but more of a construction issues. He still didn't view them as real problems because his buildings were supposed to be perfect, right?
But no, Frank Lloyd Wright seems to be the kind of person who bought into the idea of, we were talking about a mythos for architects before, and he seemed to be sort of striking a balance between believing in his own mythos and building his mythos. I refuse to believe that he was not self-aware about the kinds of things he was doing, but at the same time, I can't imagine that you would be that demanding of your clients if you weren't to some degree doing that genuinely, you know?
It's been told that Wright goes into a house that he designed after the clients moved in already.
Sure. Yeah.
And he sees shoes lying around. And he asks the client, hey, why are the shoes there? And the client says, well, that's where I want to put them. That's where I figured would be a nice spot. And Wright says, no, that's the wrong spot. You should put them over there. That's where they're supposed to go. So the level of design that goes into where you should put every single item.
It's almost like a religious thing at that point.
While taking some ideas from modernism in terms of geometric expression and horizontal buildings, blah, blah.
Clean lines.
He still stuck to a lot of partisan approaches to architecture, which was designing every element and building every element.
Yeah, you can really see that influence in the Roman brick structures that he used. Do you remember the name of the house that they filmed Blade Runner in?
Absolutely not.
No, neither do I. It was a house in California where every brick was this custom geometric form and no two bricks were the same. And it was this carefully sculpted interlay of lines and motions. It was fascinating. The whole building was constructed of these bricks.
Wow.
Yeah. It was really cool.
Yeah, no, in certain ways it's inspiring to see that level of design, right? But also it's very obsessive in a way that
absolutely. And you have to be a bit of a bastard to try and get that kind of building built.
Absolutely, yeah. This beer was a good segue to Frank Lloyd Wright, so we're going to finish it now.
We should do that more often.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. That's probably going to show up on the waveform when I'm editing. I can just toss it in.
So that was the fourth beer, Frank Lloyd Wright. Now we're going to move to the fifth beer, which is our last beer, unfortunately. I mean, it's unfortunate that the episode is ending, but it's probably good for us to stop drinking at some point.
We really need to.
I think since we've done drinking beers, let's do this one together.
Yeah. Liquid with bubbles.
Yeah, it's
I got as far as liquid with bubbles.
It's not that impressive to me. It's a very beer-branded beer.
It's beer brand beer? Yeah, I agree completely. That's when they sell this can, it's just beer. This is Doug Ford's Buck of Beer brand beer. Woo!
Look at that. We cracked the code. All right.
We've solved Ontario.
Well, I mean, it is. Since we are in Ontario and we're right now in Toronto, and we want to talk about architecture that is boring.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we have a lot of...
We've got so much we can work with. Rise and Sprawl is on the desk right over there.
Right over there. So for those who are perhaps not living in Toronto, Toronto has been known for very tasteless architecture.
Tasteless in as explicit a sense as possible, as
Yeah.
in you look at it and your eyes unfocus and you look
Yeah.
away and you don't realize there was ever a building there.
Yeah, I think this beer really translates into that.
Yeah, I
for
think
me,
so.
it's an unimpressive architecture.
It
It's
is
something that does not make a statement.
Now, to the ladies and gentlemen who work at Kensington Brewery, your beer is quite good. By and large, we really, really like it. This is by no means to say that this is a bad beer. We really appreciate that you're secretly paying us thousands of dollars to drink your beer and talk about it on the internet to our 5 listeners who are all our friends. But it has to be said, this last beer is severely underwhelming.
Yeah, compared to all the other ones that we've been drinking. right?
Exactly. The same way that a condo building can be lovely to live in. I've been in so many condos that you walk in and you're like, man, this feels like somebody really made it their home.
Yeah.
And then you walk around outside and you're like, man, I'm walking around in a concrete valley and I'm surrounded by boredom on every side. There's
Yeah.
nothing to look at. My eyes just bounce off the building.
Absolutely. It's a beer to consume, which is fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
It's like condo architecture that's just there to live in. It's there to house people. It's a machine for placing humans in
Right.
when they need to go to bed.
Right.
That is very much how it seems developers look at living in Toronto to a large extent. And-
Although they look at profit as well.
no.
But
The only reason they do it is profit.
it's providing
living.
units. That's the extent that it goes.
It ignores the inherent complexities of human living.
Right.
Hoping that the humans who live in it will fill their spaces with that complexity. It's not like Alejandro Aravena, where they leave sections of a building unbuilt so the occupants can renovate it into something interesting and special for
Right.
themselves. This is just a box. Nobody is ever going to give it an award for anything. It just exists.
Right. I think in reality, it's actually the legacy of modernism that remains today.
100%.
The steel and glass superstructure that is massive, it's tall, it provides units, you know, it's functional, everything that a modernist would dream about, but it's meh.
The context in which it was exciting has completely disappeared.
Right.
You know, if you look at the twisting streets of Paris, if that was the context that I lived in, I might consider Corbusier's proposal to burn down half of Paris
Right.
and put up condo towers as pretty interesting because you've got a whole lot of open space, you got a whole lot of light coming into the city, which would otherwise just be bouncing off rooftops in a pre-Haussmannized Paris.
Right.
But that's just not our situation now. But like Toronto architecture, it's kind of boring.
Yeah.
Kind of sucks.
Yeah. Hopefully we can change that. One of the reasons we're doing the podcast
Exactly.
is to hopefully encourage discussion.
Oh, well, no. Okay. This is actually a good opportunity. This is somehow our
We did it.
meandering nonsense has led us to a good opportunity. The plan for future episodes, every episode is going to contain 4 sections. The first section will talk about current events, architecture news, and just topics that we're interested in. And then you will choose a topic and pair it with a drink. I will choose a topic and pair it with a drink. And if we have a guest on, then one of us can hand off our drink to them. Finally, we will eat a small multi-part meal based on a free association with architecture topics. Architecture topics that we will choose by leafing through books
Yeah.
and choosing words at random.
Yeah. That sounds like a good plan, Daniel.
Almost like we talked about it beforehand. Yep.
No, it was absolutely spontaneous.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that rustling of papers you heard, that was just my
That
hair.
was, yeah, wind blowing through trees.
Wind blowing through the massive hole in my head that causes me to talk like this.
We do have a number of books here with us today. I'm going to briefly mention them, and Daniel and I are going to perhaps talk about what they are.
We're stealing this from Let's Drown Out by Gabriel Morton and Yahtzee Croshaw. The idea is at the end of every episode, we will choose a book and we will randomly choose a page in that book. And we will randomly choose a word from a page in that book and use that to
Guide, let's
guide
say. Yeah.
what our theme will be for the next podcast episode.
Yeah.
Do you want to do this now?
Sure. Okay, so we have a few books here.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 books.
SMLXL definitely counts for more than just one book.
Yeah. So the first book is a guide to Expo 67
Yep.
in Montreal.
Which Canadians of a certain age will recognize and nobody else will.
The title is Man and His World, which was the title of the exhibition.
It was the theme, yeah.
It was the theme of the
Yeah.
exhibition, right? Not the title. It was a theme.
Also that.
Expo 67 was a world exhibition of architecture. It brought together very different nations, and each nation made a pavilion to represent them, basically. And so that's the first book. The second book is by Walter Gropius. It's called Scope of Total Architecture.
I really like this book. It's got a lot of faults, and Gropius has a lot of faults, but Scope of Total Architecture is really interesting because it talks about the social aspects of modernism in simple but complex terms.
Right. To give a nice brief description,
Sure.
It's written that the ideals of modern movement in architecture, city planning, and design explained by one of the 20th century's greatest architects.
Yeah, that's basically it.
All right. So the third book?
Our third book is Rise and Sprawl by Hans Eblings and Partisans. I feel that we should disclose that I had a studio with Alex Josephson of Partisans as this book launched.
Oh,
so
wow.
I bought this because it was required reading for the studio. It's a fantastic book. It talks about condos in Toronto.
Right. Actually, I want to mention something quite interesting. Like last night, I didn't know Daniel was going to put this book on the table today. Last night, I had a dream. So the cover of this book, it's a question mark made of different condos. Last night, surprisingly, I had a dream that there was a building in Toronto shaped like a question mark. This is what I dream about,
Partisans
guys.
is infiltrating your mind.
This is what I dream about.
Awesome. I love it.
And this morning I come here and Daniel has this book on the table. So, interesting coincidence.
Yeah. What a coinkadink.
Quinkadink. So, the fourth book is a book that I don't know about.
You don't know?
No.
Oh, man. Gimme. Atlas of Novel Tectonics is Reiser and Umemoto's manifesto on using parametric architecture in intentional ways. So specifically, it's things like, here, I'm looking at de-evolutionary architecture. So for example, instead of calculating out how you can turn a particular abstract form into a grid, you just model the grid in the physical world and then you lay strings across the model.
Right.
Generating an analog computer, essentially. It's basically talking about using all of this technology in intentional and careful ways and all of the pitfalls that people fall into. For example, modeling architecture after abstract mathematical concepts instead of weaponizing those concepts for design, right?
Right.
Like an architecture student might model a building in a very rainy region of the world after the bar graph that shows how often it rains in that area, which is patently insane and ridiculous, but people do it instead of modeling a building that reacts to the conditions as opposed to just describing the conditions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So our fifth book is a book by Buckminster Fuller, and it's called Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. It's a very famous book. Buckminster Fuller, of course, experimental architect. His main, I guess, invention is the geodesic dome.
Yes.
And he was a very experimental architect, wanting to push the boundaries of architecture, thinking very outside of the box. And I think it would be useful for us to take a look at his writing.
Indeed. He's a self-professed futurist who also relates directly to Expo 67.
Right, exactly. He was the architect of the U.S. Pavilion in Expo 67.
A geodesic dome.
A geodesic
Or sphere.
It was basically a sphere for the U.S. to display their advances in technology and space technology during the Cold War. It was a very politically oriented project.
Indeed.
It was very interesting. The last book is perhaps 10 books. It's quite heavy.
It's a seminal work.
It's a monument in and of itself. And it's the SMLXL by OMA, Rem Koolhaas, and Bruce Mao. It's called SMLXL, or Small, Medium, Large, and X Large. If you wanted to describe the book itself, it's definitely an X large.
Yeah, no, the description of SMLXL definitely starts at its weight.
Yeah, it's quite a heavy, massive, monumental book with
Every
a
time
silver color.
Every time we put it down on the table, the whole table vibrates.
Yeah, listen to it.
Yeah. SMLXL is almost entirely composed of various levels
Essays.
of collage.
Right, and it's a collection of essays, actually.
You wouldn't know it just by leafing through it.
Because it's a very visual work. There are perhaps more image in this than any text.
Yeah.
But it is composed of a collection of essays by Rem Koolhaas himself and Bruce Mao. Very influential book. And we're going to put it on top of the other books. Quite heavy. So we chose Man and His World as the book that we're going to use to guide our discussion for the next time. We're going to open the book randomly and choose a word within the page that we open. And we're each going to do that. And the two words that we find are going to guide our discussions for the next time. So here's what I'm going to do now.
Stop.
All right. Tell me when to stop.
Stop.
It's French. Okay.
What is it?
It's... I can't read it because I don't know French, unfortunately. It's this word.
It's engineer.
Engineer.
Yes.
So...
Ingénieur.
Okay, so engineer is the first word. Go ahead, second.
All right.
Stop. Stop.
Jeunesse.
Which means...
Youth.
Youth. Okay, youth and engineering. Or engineer.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll try to make this work for next time. All right, I hope you enjoyed this first episode. This was the pilot episode, and we will come back with more content very shortly.
Yeah, Post and Lentil is supposed to have a monthly release schedule, so whenever this goes up, expect another release in about 4 weeks. You want to do a duet?
Yeah. We both went high. When two musicians.
Yeah. Oh, man. I've said it before, but this time I really mean it. I think we've got our intro.